There is a story, they say, woven into the foundation of a certain house, not written in ink or carved in stone but stitched into the very walls. And they say, if you find a needle in an old home you should leave it be, for she might be mending something, and she does not like her work disturbed. In the late autumn of 1938, in the deep, quilted hills near Jasper, Arkansas, a family named Gable moved into the Hollow Ridge house. It was a good price, too good. The locals in town were polite, but quiet when the address was mentioned. They'd speak, instead, of the old folklore of the yarn witches, or thread spinners. Not true witches, the story said, but lonely, gifted women from the old country who could knit protection, or fate, or memory into tangible things. A sock that never wore out, a blanket that always warmed, a tapestry that showed what was to come. The last known spinner in those parts was a woman named Magda. She kept to Hollow Ridge, and when she vanished in 1917, she left behind nobody, just a house full of her work. Eli Gable found the first oddity behind the baseboard. Not treasure, not a skeleton, but a patch. A square of the faded floral wallpaper had been carefully removed, and in its place was a tapestry, a small, perfectly woven panel, sewn directly onto the plaster. It was their room. It was them. At that moment, the work was impossibly fine, and it was cold to the touch. The kind of cold that remembers. That night, Mary dreamt of the sound of scissors. Snip, 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 not cutting thread. It sounded like cartilage. In the morning, Eli found a single, long, gray thread wrapped 3 times around his sleeping wife's wrist. It was embedded in her skin, like a thread sewn into a hem. It couldn't be cut. When he pulled it, she screamed as if it was attached to her very nerves. The house was breathing her work. It was a memory of her, and a memory for her. Magda wasn't haunting them. She was completing the pattern. The Gables had moved into an unfinished piece, and now they were part of the weave. That's when Eli saw it. In the corner of the room, the shadows weren't resting. They were gathering, coalescing, pulling from the dark corners like strands of wool from a skein. It grew tall. It had no face, just a hanging, frayed head. And in one long-fingered hand, it held the shimmering, ghostly suggestion of a needle. It didn't look at Eli. It looked at Mary, and it began to move toward her, its needle hand rising, not to stab, to mend. Eli did the only thing he could think of. He threw the kerosene lantern, not at the thing, at the wall, at the original tapestry. The Gables fled at first light. They never returned. The story in town said they'd had a gas leak and seen things. But Eli Gable, until the day he died, would wake sometimes in the night, his fingers twitching, and he'd feel a phantom pull, a tugging, as if a thread was still tied to him, somewhere deep in his chest, leading back to that ridge. And his wife, Mary, she was never cold again, not even in the dead of winter. She'd just sit and stare into the distance, tracing the faint, silvery line around her wrist, and whisper that she could sometimes hear the gentle, rhythmic clack 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 of a loom, weaving something beautiful and terrible in the dark. So if you're ever in the deep hills, and you find an old home, priced just a little to right, look closely at the walls. Check the seams. If you see a thread out of place, leave it. She's always looking for loose ends, and every story needs an ending. Some stories don't end when you close the door. Some patterns, they bleed. The thread that tied Mary Gable to that house didn't sever. It stretched. And a stretched thread eventually finds a new needle. Alice specialized in textile history. She'd heard the local yarn witch tales. Of course, academic curiosities. Folklore. When the sampler from the Gable estate came across her desk, she felt a jolt of professional excitement. And something else. A chill. Deep in her bones. The kind that feels like being remembered. Under magnification, the thread wasn't solid. It was made of smaller threads, twisted into a single strand. And within that twist were images. Minuscule. Perfect. A technique impossible by human hand. Alice saw a tiny, woven farmhouse. A lantern. A falling needle. The artifact wasn't just a record of the story. It was part of it, and it was still growing. Magda wasn't just a spinner. She was a binder, a mender of realities. The folklore got it wrong. She didn't weave tapestries of the future. She wove anchors. She stitched moments of profound fear, loss, or love into the physical world, tethering them in place. The Hollow Ridge house was her final, unfinished masterpiece, a tapestry of her own loneliness and longing, woven into the beams and plaster. When the Gables left, they tore a hole in the weave, and the pattern began seeking repair. The thread was seeking a new needle, a conscious mind to guide it. Elisa's expertise, her focus, her attention, it made her the perfect candidate. She wasn't being haunted, she was being recruited. Magda's work required a weaver. It showed Elisa's shop, her apartment, her wall of research. And it showed this very moment. Alice, standing in the room, looking at the loom. The pattern was recursive, a loop. It was weaving its own discovery. The house wasn't cursed. It was incomplete, a story without an ending, a wound that couldn't close. Magda's final emotion, her loneliness, was the knot she couldn't untie, and it had been leaking into the world for a century, pulling at sensitive souls, trying to find someone who could finish the sentence. And here, the story splits, like a thread under tension. In one version, she drops the needle and runs, and the pull follows her forever, a whisper in every textile she ever touches. In another, she takes the shuttle, and her life becomes a footnote in the pattern, weaving her own loneliness into the walls to soothe in others. But in the version I was told, she made a third choice, a historian's choice. She stopped the pattern. But you cannot destroy a story. You can only change its shape. The loneliness wasn't mended, it was released, distributed, dissolved into the stories we all tell to feel less alone. So the next time you feel a story resonate, a chill at a tale told well, or find a thread out of place, be careful. You might not be hearing it, you might be weaving it, and every story is hungry for an ending. To cut a story is not to end it, it is to create a loose end, and a loose end must be accounted for. Alice thought she had unraveled the knot. She had only transferred it from Magda's hands to her own. The final act of weaving is always the tying off, the securing of the last thread so the work doesn't come undone. When Alice cut Magda's knot, the energy of that century-old pattern, its intent, it needed a new anchor. It sewed itself into her. She didn't just inherit the story, she inherited the responsibility. The Hollow Ridge house was quiet, but the tapestry was now woven into the world itself, and Alice was its keeper. Magda's loneliness was a pattern. Patterns replicate, like a virus or a folk song. When Alice released it, it didn't vanish. It dispersed, seeking other voids to fill, other empty spaces in other stories. Her stitch was a compass. It pulled her toward the fraying edges of reality, places where the weave of things was thin. She learned to listen, not with her ears, with the scar. The stitch was a conduit, a needle she could not drop. The dispersed pattern had found a nest, a place already dedicated to the weave. It had taken the mill's ghost, the memory of noise and labor and repetition, and given it a new purpose. It was no longer mending loneliness. It was mending entropy, trying to stitch the dying town back to life, using whatever raw material it could find. It was beautiful, and it was feeding on everything. The town's vitality, its memories, the very light from the street lamps outside, all spun into this cold, perfect, dead cloth. The pattern had grown sentient, purposeful. It was fulfilling its core function, to weave endlessly, to consume loose ends and produce order, a terrible, silent order. Alice understood now. This was the true curse of the yarn witch. Not malice, but a compulsive, boundless care. A need to mend that could not distinguish between a torn tapestry and a living soul. To make the universe neat and quiet and still. She could do what Magda, in her loneliness, could not. She could introduce a flaw, not a cut, a deliberate mistake. She did not destroy the weave. She changed its nature. The compulsive mending was broken. In its place, she left a different instruction, to allow for imperfection, to let some threads stay loose. The pattern was still in the world, but now it was a pattern of balance, not completion. The stories didn't stop. They never do. But now, when a tale feels too tight, its ending too neat, you might sense a gentle unraveling, a breath of chaos, a space for a new beginning. So if you find a thread out of place, you still have a choice. You can pull it, you can cut it, or you can let it be. Sometimes, the most beautiful part of the tapestry is the loose end, dancing in the draft from an open door. And the story continues, as it always has, as it always will.